So, who remembers this? This is the Sony Xperia Play, otherwise known as the PlayStation phone. Released in 2011, it was an Android smartphone with a built-in PlayStation controller, allowing games to be controlled traditionally with buttons. With the Sony Xperia Play, one could play both Android games as well as dedicated PlayStation ports and ROMs. Unfortunately, the phone did not receive a particularly good reception and was discontinued after just one generation. In this video, I would like to take a look back and tell you more about the device. We will look at the history of the smartphone and explore the question of whether the Sony Xperia Play is still useful in 2024 and what can be done with it. Have fun. The gaming world looked very different in 2006. The Xbox 360 had been on the market for a year and was dominating the HD generation, while the PlayStation 3 and the Nintendo Wii were both released that year. Meanwhile, Nintendo and Sony were engaged in their battle in the handheld market, without fearing significant competition from other manufacturers. Since the iPhone would not revolutionize the mobile market until a year later, humanity was still using classic mobile devices in 2006, which, although they offered games, were quite rudimentary at the time and were not particularly easy to play with the selection buttons of the mobile phones of that era. In 2006, however, rumors also began to emerge about a PlayStation phone that was supposedly in development at Sony. It was about a device that would combine the convenience of a PlayStation controller with the technology of a modern mobile phone. A patent entry from Sony, which mentioned a PlayStation phone, further confirmed the rumors. In 2007, a manager from Sony Ericsson announced that they were working on a device specifically designed for gaming. This also intensified the rumors that Sony would release a phone with DualShock buttons. However, Sony of Europe vehemently denied the rumors, even though most of us probably did not hear about them. The influence and media presence of the first iPhone, which was presented to the public by Steve Jobs on January 9th of that year, was simply too great. Nevertheless, Sony Ericsson spoke again throughout the year about a dedicated device for gaming without providing further details. Thus, the game continued for the next 2 years. Sony Ericsson fueled the rumor mill, while Sony Europe denied everything, and there were even reports that Sony had completely scrapped the plan and cancelled the device. In 2010, the online site Gadget leaked the first images of the rumored smartphone. It was about an Android-based device that would feature PSP-like buttons through a slide mechanism. And when the leak gained more attention, Sony finally announced the smartphone officially in early 2011. The PlayStation phone was introduced as the Sony Xperia Play and thus belonged to the Xperia series, which had been marketed by Sony Ericsson since 2008. Unlike previous Xperia devices, the Sony Xperia Play was actually a hybrid of a smartphone and a PlayStation controller with an Android operating system and physical buttons. The idea behind the Sony Xperia Play was truly good. In 2011, the Google Play Store was only 3 years old, and gaming on smartphones was still in its infancy. At that time, the Play Store was still called Android Market and offered smaller Android games that could be downloaded onto the smartphone to pass the time. However, the popularity of smartphones increasingly contributed to a rapid rise in the quality of mobile games, and more video game publishers like Ubisoft, EA, and Sega began to consider releasing their brands in the mobile market. Sony and Nintendo increasingly faced a new competitive market, which led Sony to attempt to conquer it with a product aimed at gamers. Offering a smartphone that made those games playable with classic buttons was a good idea and certainly interesting for countless gamers who struggled with the touch inputs of common devices. Furthermore, Sony planned to release a certified PlayStation store called PlayStation Mobile, which was intended to offer PlayStation and later also PSP games on smartphones. With the Sony Xperia Play, you could kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Gamers could play PlayStation games on the go with classic buttons and even enjoy new Android games with traditional controls, as long as they were patched for the Sony Xperia Play. The Xperia Play was not intended to compete with the in-house PSP, but rather to be established as a third pillar alongside the handheld and console markets. In February 2011, it finally happened, and the Sony Xperia Play was released first in Europe and a month later in the USA. Interestingly, Sony decided against a release in its home country. However, I could not find out the reasons for this. However, the response at the release was rather mixed. Technically speaking, the smartphone was rather mediocre with a Snapdragon S processor and the Adreno 205 GPU. The 4-inch display, which offered a resolution of 480 x 854 pixels, as well as the 512 MB of RAM and the 400 MB of internal storage, were also not very impressive. Competing products like the Samsung Galaxy S or the iPhone 4 were technically superior, including in terms of the camera. With a 5.1 megapixel camera on the back and a modest 0.3 megapixel front camera, Sony Ericsson really couldn't entice anyone out from behind the stove. Android. Gingerbread was pre-installed, which was also found on other devices at the time, and the 1500 mAh battery guaranteed several hours of operation, although this varied depending on whether the Sony Xperia Play was used as a smartphone or as a gaming handheld. Speaking of the integrated buttons, the smartphone was thicker than comparable products, which was also criticized by some, but I mean the buttons have to go somewhere. When you trigger the slide mechanism, which still feels very satisfying, the buttons familiar from the PlayStation controller come into view. These strongly resemble the layout of the PSP Go, but they differ in one important aspect. In addition to the well-known D-pad and the 4 face buttons, as well as start and select, the Sony Xperia Play features 2 analog touchpads on the front instead of traditional analog sticks. The choice of touchpads is somewhat understandable after all. 2 analog sticks would have made the device even thicker. However, the touchpads are of a quality that takes some getting used to and vary significantly in terms of handling depending on the game, but more on that later. Otherwise, the quality of the buttons is as high as usual, although this does not really apply to the underlying L and R buttons. Unfortunately, these are very small and extremely cumbersome to use, but at least they serve their purpose in the mid-range. As a smartphone, the hopes were placed on the gaming experience that the Sony Xperia Play would provide. To get started right away, 5 games were pre-installed on the device: Crash Bandicoot, FIFA 10, The Sims, 3 Bruce Lee games, Dragon Warrior, and Star Battalion, with Americans also receiving Madden 10. The games were accessible from both the Android menu and the Sony Xperia Play menu, which presented the titles in a much clearer manner. At launch, there were also over 50 additional Android games available, all of which were also accessible on other devices, but could be played on the Sony Xperia Play with classic buttons. And it worked surprisingly well. However, Sony Ericsson failed to offer exclusive games to further differentiate the device from the rest. Yes, the games were all playable with buttons, but they were just regular Android games. The Sony Xperia Play lacked a killer app that was available on the Galaxy S or the iPhone 4. Shortly after, a game called Minecraft Pocket Edition was released, which was at least temporarily exclusive to the Sony Xperia Play. However, this was not enough for many smartphone enthusiasts to justify the purchase of the PlayStation phone. And yes, there were Sony's own PS games that could initially only be purchased and played on the Sony Xperia Play, but Sony recorded less than 1,000 downloads per PS title just 1 month after the smartphone's release, which was a complete flop and indicated the direction the journey with the Sony Xperia Play was headed. Unfortunately, I could not find official sales figures, but the fact that Sony abandoned the PlayStation phone concept after just 1 generation suggests that it was not particularly successful for Sony. Just a few months after its release, the smartphone experienced a rapid price drop and was offered for only half of the initial price. In Germany, the original price recommendation from Sony Ericsson was $649. In August 2011, GamePro reported that the Sony Xperia Play was available for only $340. In fact, a successor was even planned in 2012, as a leak from 2019 proves. Unfortunately, the successor to the Sony Xperia Play was never finalized, and starting in 2012, Sony returned to offering classic Android smartphones within the Xperia series. As for gaming, the company focused on the PS Vita, although this too was not particularly successful. The reasons why the PlayStation phone flopped are not well documented anywhere. Some attribute the average technology, the lackluster display, and the absence of exclusive game offerings as the driving factors behind the demise of the Sony Xperia Play. Others argue that the price for what was offered was simply too high and that Sony approached the matter with unrealistic expectations. I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle. The concept of the smartphone was great, but the implementation actually left much to be desired. As with any other video game system, its value is defined by the game offerings and the games available exclusively. And there was, in fact, not a single one on the Sony Xperia Play. I still remember very well that I heard about the Sony Xperia Play back then and thought the concept was really cool. However, I was already in the Samsung Galaxy camp and quite satisfied with my Galaxy S. A purchase of the Sony Xperia Play was out of the question for me, as I simply played too few Android games. At that time, I also owned a Samsung Galaxy Tab on which I tried out a few games such as Dead Space, Mass Effect Infiltrator, Backstab, or Sacred Odyssey. But using touch controls was anything but fun. And just to be able to play those small Android games with buttons, I didn't really want to buy a Sony Xperia Play back then. But how was it for you? Feel free to share that in the comments. Nevertheless, I think the concept can work, especially in today's time. But enough of the history lesson. After a short break, let's take a look at what you can do with the Sony Xperia Play today. Nowadays, the Sony Xperia Play is completely useless as a smartphone. Yes, you can connect to your home Wi-Fi and browse the internet through the browser, or take photos and videos in glorious 5.1 megapixels with its fantastic camera. But most services have long been shut down. You can no longer make phone calls with it. The device uses the G standard, which was already discontinued in Germany in 2021. YouTube, other social media services like Facebook, and also the Android market, the predecessor of the Google Play Store, are no longer functional. However, as a handheld, the Sony Xperia Play offers various possibilities if one engages with the available games and takes some time to get them onto the device. The problem is that you can no longer download games such as Android games or PlayStation games and emulators from the Android market. You need to sideload it, which means you have to obtain the APK files and the data packages from the internet and transfer them to the Sony Xperia Play via a direct connection with your home computer. It is not so easy to find the right APK files, as only certain versions of the Android games were compatible with the Sony Xperia Play smartphone. In my research, I came across a small Xperia Play community that exchanges information on a Discord server. They share and provide assistance. Here I also found some games and downloaded a few onto my device. To do this, I used an SD card so that I could expand my storage capacity from 400 MB to load more games onto it. It is important that all the data packages remain on the SD card, while the APK files of the games are installed on the internal storage. Basically, one could also root the device to gain more options, but I decided against that in my case. I just wanted to play games with my Sony Xperia Play, and it worked fine without rooting. All the games that can be installed and played on the device today can be divided into three categories. On one hand, there are the Android games, which could technically be categorized into three subcategories. There are ports of well-known games such as Tetris, Max Payne, GTA 3, or a few classics from Sega like Crazy Taxi, Virtual Tennis, or Sonic. But Minecraft and Lara Croft have also made it to the Sony Xperia Play. By the way, Tetris is one of the games that did not receive any adaptation for the Xperia Play buttons. But it's really not that bad. Tetris can also be played quite comfortably using touch controls. All other ports can be played completely using the classic buttons, although you really have to get used to the touchpads, as they are responsible for controlling both the main character and the camera. Here you can see, for example, Max Payne, which looks really good, and plays quite well too. The same applies to other ports like GTA 3, the Sega games, or even Minecraft. In addition to the ports, we would have standalone spin-offs of well-known game series. By the way, Gameloft was responsible for most of these games. Believe me, I have really gotten tired of this intro here in the last few weeks. But the standalone Android games from Dead Space, Mass Effect, Avatar, and many other well-known game franchises are the main reason why I would still recommend the Sony Xperia Play today. I mean, we are talking about the first generation of Android games here. These are nicely entertaining, not too long, have a high production value, and are completely free of any microtransactions or pay-to-win content. For example, take a look at Dead Space. The game was specifically developed for mobile devices and features a completely independent storyline. Additionally, I can comfortably control the game on the Sony Xperia Play using the buttons, and the movement via the touchpads is also well implemented. This makes the game enjoyable, and I can finally catch up on it. The same applies to Mass Effect Infiltrator, which was made by the same development team, but unfortunately was not tailored as elegantly to the Sony Xperia Play. The character can only be controlled via the touchscreen and not through the touchpads of the controller. Just like the camera, which is unfortunately a bit cumbersome but still makes the game playable. And those weren't even the only EA games to discover on the Sony Xperia Play. I tried FIFA 10 and FIFA 12, and I'm also excited about the 3 Need for Speed games that I installed. Need for Speed Shift has particularly captivated me. It's wonderfully arcade-like, with great graphics, smooth gameplay, and an awesome soundtrack. That's how I like my racing games. In addition to the EA titles, I also tried a Call of Duty from Activision, but I am struggling with the controls. Completely different with Brothers in Arms 2 from Ubisoft. Unlike the console versions, this is a straightforward first-person shooter. that reminded me more of the Medal of Honor series in terms of gameplay. And while we're at it, there is even a Battlefield Bad Company 2 on the Sony Xperia Play, and it not only looks great but also plays really well. Other notable games that I have tried are Pro Evolution Soccer, Assassin's Creed, Splinter Cell Conviction, Rainbow Six, and Virtua Tennis. And they all brought me a hell of a lot of fun. Not to forget Spider-Man, which with its comic look and short levels was just right for a quick break and isn't available on other systems. Speaking of which, let's talk about availability. If you think that you can simply catch up on the games on a modern device, you are mistaken. None of these games are listed anymore and therefore not available. And even if you obtain the APK files from other sources, the games are simply no longer supported by current Android versions. The only way to relive the games shown here is on an old Android smartphone, and the Sony Xperia Play with its buttons is simply the best choice and still recommended today if you happen to come across such a device at an affordable price. But well, let's take a look at the third subcategory of Android games. These would be the exclusive games that were only available on mobile devices. And especially Gameloft has developed some good games, although I must admit that many of them are simply copycats of other well-known brands. For example, the Modern Combat games, which are clearly inspired by Call of Duty. I have played Modern Combat 3 and 4 and must say that they are quite impressive in terms of presentation. However, the developers have not managed to make the controls usable on the touchpads of the Sony Xperia Play. Especially the camera control is quite difficult to get used to. It works much better in Brothers in Arms 2. But let's take a look at a few other clones. Asphalt 6 is a good arcade-style racing game that is clearly inspired by Need for Speed and Burnout, and it controls really well on the Sony Xperia Play. Nova 2, on the other hand, is more oriented towards a Halo or Crysis. As an elite soldier in a powerful suit, you fight against numerous enemies in this first-person shooter, which has been presented very coolly, similar to Modern Combat, and also runs significantly better in terms of controls. If you are more into role-playing games, you should check out Dungeon Hunter 2. Also developed by Gameloft, this action RPG leans more towards the Diablo style and offers you numerous enemies to slay, as well as tons of loot and a nice fantasy story that keeps you engaged for a few hours. And Xbox owners should find the gameplay of Shadowgun more than familiar, as it was inspired by the Gears of War series, which is especially noticeable in the character's movement and the cover mechanics, both of which work excellently on the Sony Xperia Play. In 2011, Shadowgun was certainly one of the most visually stunning Android games of the first generation. Back then, I wanted to play it on the Samsung Galaxy Tab, but unfortunately the fun of the game was really limited due to the touch controls. However, I can finally catch up on the game now on the Sony Xperia Play. In addition to the numerous games that are clearly inspired by well-known franchises, the Sony Xperia Play also offers enough standalone gaming experiences, such as Bruce Lee Dragon Warrior, for example. The fighting game was even awarded the best mobile game in Cannes in 2011, although I found the gameplay to be rather mixed. I liked the action-adventure Sacred Odyssey much better. First of all, I had to marvel at the graphics when I loaded the game for the first time and found myself on the main screen. I don't know, but I think it just looks really awesome. What do you think? Sacred Odyssey is a classic action-adventure game that is most reminiscent of the Zelda series in its structure, but it features completely independent worlds, a nice story, and beautiful dungeons. It is definitely a game that I want to finish on the Sony Xperia Play. I also found Eternal Legacy impressive, a true JRPG with fluid graphics, an epic story, and just 7 hours of gameplay. For those who prefer a more pixelated experience, the 3 Xenonia games offer the perfect alternative. The gameplay is reminiscent of the old SNES classics, which is also reflected in the graphics that I find really charming. And I could go on forever showing you the Batman game or the pirate adventure Backstab, the hack and slay Samurai 2, the really nice GTR, Hyundai racing game, or Wave Blazer, which playfully reminds one of Hydro Thunder by Midway, but presenting all the games in detail would really exceed the scope here. As you hopefully noticed, the Sony Xperia Play offers quite a bit of gaming fun, as long as you are willing to engage with the old Android games. Since these come without any paid content and feel just like regular handheld games on the Sony Xperia Play due to the buttons, I think it's definitely possible to catch up on a title or two. Especially since you can really install the games quickly once you have found the APK and data packages. I definitely have a clear recommendation. I really enjoyed spending the last few weeks exploring the numerous ports and original developments, but those were just the Android games. With the Sony Xperia Play, you can also play classic PS games nowadays. which is also fun and significantly expands the software library. At that time, Crash Bandicoot was pre-installed. However, if you try to start the game today, you will be confronted with an error screen, as the servers where the data packages are stored have been offline for a long time. Therefore, you also need to sideload the PS games, which is just as easy as with the Android games. With the PS Xperia program, other PS games can even be converted into a format that is recognized by the smartphone. And for those who find that too complicated, they can simply emulate the games. Once you have installed emulators like RetroArch, the Sony Xperia Play transforms into a truly capable retro handheld that can play not only NES, Super Nintendo, and the 8 and 16-bit Sega consoles, but also Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, and even Nintendo 64 and PS games. This works really well thanks to RetroArch, although the gaming experience is limited to a few titles simply because the buttons for playing are missing. The Nintendo 64 emulator does not support the touchpads, which means that, for example, the C buttons of the N controller cannot be mapped, but Mario Kart or F-Zero X can still be played damn well. However, I wouldn't necessarily buy a Sony Xperia Play for emulation, as there are now significantly better alternatives available, which are often also cheaper. For this reason, I have also spent significantly less time with emulators and ROMs, and much more time turning my Sony Xperia Play into a powerful Android handheld, with which I can catch up on the games I used to enjoy but missed back then. And if you think like I do and want to catch up on games like Dead Space, Mass Effect, Sacred Odyssey, or Shadowgun, then you should definitely check out the Sony Xperia Play, and definitely visit the Discord server of the small but fine Sony Xperia Play community. I will leave a link in the video description. And with that, I have actually said everything I wanted to say about the PlayStation phone. Back then, certainly ahead of its time with the hybrid idea, it simply lacked hardware power compared to the competition and exclusive game content, which unfortunately led to the smartphone flopping, and Sony would probably prefer to forget the device. Nevertheless, it is still possible to create a great handheld device from it today, allowing you to catch up on long forgotten but equally good Android games. Therefore, I give a clear recommendation to buy it as long as you are into that sort of thing and can get the device for under $100. But feel free to leave your opinion in the comments. Did you own a Sony Xperia Play smartphone back in 2011? Or did you, like me, steer clear of it, and would you want to play with it today? I look forward to hearing your opinions and will say goodbye for now. Thank you for watching again. If you enjoyed the video, I would appreciate a like. Until next time, here on Spielwelten, adios,